evening, NATO is tonight involved in a massive damage limitation exercise for its relations with China and Russia. When NATO missiles destroyed China's embassy in Belgrade last night, they also nearly wrecked current diplomatic efforts to end the Kosovo conflict. The Chinese were outraged at the attack, and Russia, the key player in recent peace efforts, called the NATO blunder, which killed at least 3 people, barbaric and inhuman. NATO has apologized and launched an investigation, but says the bombing goes on. From Belgrade, where the Yugoslav authorities monitor his reports, our World Affairs editor John Simpson.
Approaching the shattered embassy, it was hard to think that such a mistake could ever have been made. The embassy was a distinctive building set on open land in the middle of a residential district. They were just getting the bodies out. Arkan, whom NATO says is still a paramilitary leader and who was indicted for war crimes when the conflict started, turned up.
There is no any more aggression against Yugoslav people. Now there is aggression against the Chinese people, which they don't have nothing in this conflict.
More missiles landed close by, hitting a hotel. It was the heaviest night of attacks Belgrade has yet had to endure. The recent lull in the bombing here was well and truly over. As day came and we saw the extent of the damage, the crowds began to gather. Someone had left some flowers at the gate. As for the embassy staff, they still seemed completely bewildered. People from the big Chinese community in Belgrade began to turn up for an anti-NATO demonstration. It was very much what their government wanted, but it looked as though it reflected their own feelings too. The heavier the bombing, the more mistakes are likely to be made. And if the bombing of Belgrade is to be stepped up, then more mistakes are possible. But in political terms, this is the worst mistake of the conflict so far.
President Clinton tonight offered his sincere condolences to the Chinese government and people. But in China itself, there's been a wave of protest. An American consulate was set on fire by a student mob, and thousands more demonstrated in the capital, Beijing.
Demonstrations in Beijing are never spontaneous, but there's no mistaking the real anger there at NATO's latest military mistake in Yugoslavia, and at the warning the air campaign will go on, which accompanies the alliance's expressions of regret.
The North Atlantic Council wishes to express its deep regret for the tragic mistake of the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade.
China called a meeting of the UN Security Council to express its anger.
NATO's barbarian act is a gross violation of the United Nations Charter, international law, and the norms governing international relations.
Hitting any foreign embassy would have been at once tragic and embarrassing. Hitting China's a diplomatic nightmare. Its seat on the Security Council makes it a powerful voice at the UN. But Russia, too, has been angered by these latest scenes of destruction. It's postponed a visit to Britain by Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov and left Robin Cook to put a brave face on it.
Igor Ivanov was very keen to make it clear that the reason he was unable to come to Britain was not because of any difficulty in our bilateral relations, but because of the pressure on him to remain in Moscow in the light of the events overnight.
The Russian envoy Viktor Chernomyrdin is still talking to both sides in the conflict and may travel to Belgrade tomorrow. But he's called the Chinese embassy attack barbaric. Last night's accident hasn't ended the international diplomatic effort, but it has darkened the atmosphere around it.
The Chinese embassy in New Belgrade is in flames. Now, in the early hours of the morning, there are still firefighters struggling with the blaze, and the injured are being carried from the building to hospital.
It was criminal act, like the other criminal acts on our country.
Goran Matić is a minister in the Yugoslav government.
1 month and a half, our people was killed and bombed in the whole of country. Now it's Chinese embassy, and it was very successful hit with 2 bombs, and it isn't mistake when somebody hitting Chinese embassy with 2 bombs.
This part of the capital is largely residential, and the inhabitants have come down from their tower blocks to watch this remarkable sight, the Chinese embassy in flames.
My name is Zoran Ljubevich. I live just a few hundred yards from here. My windows were shattered, but there was otherwise no damage on the building. This is great for us, because if they had the Chinese embassy, which is, of course, Chinese territory, it can only be good for us. I mean, the Chinese certainly have to do something about this. I think it can be only good for us, nothing bad. And I think America is facing big trouble now.
Just now, as I report on the bombing of the Chinese embassy, for an instant we heard a jet overhead, and then yet more explosions in the center of Belgrade. This is proving to be one of the heaviest nights of bombing the capital has seen so far.
That was Mike Williams in Belgrade. Our correspondent Mark Devonport's on the line now from the United Nations in New York. Mark, the Chinese are not best pleased.
Well, absolutely, and who can blame them? They've been opposed in principle to NATO's military operations for some time. They have concerns that they claim it's in breach of international law, and they have concerns that the principle of sovereignty has been breached here, and obviously, given they have their own internal difficulties, they have the difficulty of Tibet, they have always been concerned about that. But now, on top of this, they have been affected directly with this bombing of their embassy, the loss of 2 lives, and obviously the situation is still under review, and I think their anger expressed overnight here at the United Nations and about to be expressed more formally in the emergency meeting of the Security Council, which is got underway already, is very real anger.
A barbarian act, they call it.
A barbarian act, a transgression of the UN Charter, and the difficulty is that beyond these expressions of anger, China was in a very sensitive position. We had the agreement between the G7 nations and Russia, an agreement on the principles that they believed should underpin any diplomatic resolution. But part of that whole process, they hoped, would be that a Security Council resolution would be passed, which would basically set up an international civil and security presence in Kosovo, or give it a mandate. Now, of course, China is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. It has a veto, and if it wants to express its anger in more fulsome and long-term ways, well, it could block that sort of progress.
Will it, do you think?
I'm not certain that it will. I think it will certainly protest very vigorously in the days ahead, but I think that it may well be that in the longer term, not only the NATO countries, but also possibly Russia will say to the Chinese, the broader picture here is to find a resolution to this, to end the violence, to end not only NATO's bombing, which China has called for an immediate halt to, but also the violence on the ground in Kosovo being perpetrated by the Serbian authorities. So it may be that in the longer term, China will see that there's a need for a resolution to this.
Are we beginning to see the UN removing all this from NATO's hands, or certainly trying very hard to?
Well, certainly this has directly placed the centre of events once again in the UN because of China's position, and I mean the NATO powers had no alternative given the circumstances other than to agree to China's demand for an emergency session. America is still reiterating that it doesn't believe that there should be a fully fledged UN peacekeeping force in Kosovo. It doesn't want to see that because of the fact that China and Russia have vetoes on the Security Council, and because of the history of Bosnia, where it didn't believe that the UN played a particular role. But it will be that much more difficult, I think, for the NATO powers to set the parameters for the way things work out from now, because clearly all these mistakes that we've seen, and now this greatest mistake of all, have robbed them of some of their moral authority in this whole business.